It was a bitterly cold evening when Martin first heard the rumors about the abandoned mansion on Blackwood Hill. For years, the place had been the subject of whispered conversations in town, but no one dared to go near it. They said the mansion was cursed, haunted by a bride who had been left at the altar decades ago. A tragedy had unfolded there, and since then, anyone foolish enough to set foot inside was never heard from again. Martin wasn't the superstitious type. A skeptic, he dismissed the talk as nothing more than town folklore. After all, the mansion was an architectural marvel, decaying and untouched for years. To him, it represented an opportunity, an eerie but captivating place for his photography project. His plan was simple: spend the night, take some atmospheric shots, and prove that the mansion's ghosts were just stories. As he drove up the winding road toward the mansion, the evening fog thickened, wrapping itself around his car like a shroud. Blackwood Hill stood above him like a looming giant, its peak swallowed by the darkening sky. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his mind flashing briefly to the warnings from the townspeople. "It's just a house," he muttered under his breath, though unease prickled his skin. When he finally arrived, the mansion was more foreboding than he had imagined. Its grand wooden doors hung slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of blackness inside. Martin stepped out of his car, his camera slung over his shoulder, and walked up to the entrance. The iron gates creaked as he pushed them open, their sound disturbingly loud in the silence of the night. Once inside the grounds, the air felt heavier, colder. Martin snapped a few pictures of the mansion's exterior, capturing the jagged, broken windows and vines creeping up the walls like bony fingers. He took a deep breath and headed toward the open door. But as soon as he crossed the threshold, he felt it, the overwhelming sensation of being watched. He paused, glancing behind him. The front yard lay empty, the fog swirling lazily under the moonlight. His heartbeat quickened, but he forced himself to press on. The interior of the mansion was frozen in time. Dust coated the floor like a blanket, and broken chandeliers hung precariously from the ceiling. The place smelled of mildew and decay, the air thick and suffocating. As Martin ventured deeper into the house, he noticed something strange. The dust, which should have covered everything, was disturbed in certain places. Footprints. They were faint but unmistakable. Someone or something had walked here recently. He followed the trail with growing unease, his camera at the ready. The prints led him down a long, narrow hallway lined with cracked mirrors. His footsteps echoed, the only sound in the oppressive silence. At the end of the hall, a single door stood closed. Martin hesitated for a moment before slowly pushing it open. The room was empty, save for a large antique mirror on the far wall. He raised his camera, focusing on the mirror's cracked surface. But as he peered through the lens, he froze. There, standing behind him in the reflection, was a woman. Her eyes were sunken, her dress torn and tattered, the veil over her face a yellowed ruin. And though her mouth did not move, Martin heard her voice, soft, whispering, filled with venom. "You shouldn't have come." The camera slipped from his hands and crashed to the floor. He spun around, but there was no one there. Martin's heart raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. The hallway was empty, the room silent. But the words still echoed in his mind, chilling him to the bone. He wasn't alone. And now, there was no going back. Martin stood frozen, his breath shallow as the weight of the eerie encounter sank in. The mansion had felt cold before, but now it seemed to pulse with an unnatural chill. His mind reeled as he tried to rationalize what he had just seen. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, a reflection warped by the cracked mirror. His thoughts raced, desperately seeking any explanation other than the one his gut screamed. The woman in the mirror was real. He crouched to pick up his camera, hands trembling. The lens was shattered, rendering it useless, but that wasn't his biggest concern. The feeling of being watched hadn't left him. If anything, it had intensified. Every shadow seemed alive, every creak of the old house a footstep trailing just behind him. He needed to leave. Now, as Martin turned to retrace his steps, the hallway behind him seemed longer than before. The cracked mirrors on either side reflected only darkness now, as though they were windows to some other realm. The air grew thicker, pressing down on him, making it harder to breathe. Then the whispers started. At first, they were faint, barely audible, like wind slipping through the cracks in the walls. But soon they grew louder, more distinct, filling his ears with words he couldn't quite understand. They weren't in English, but he felt their meaning in his bones. Accusations, anger, and sorrow, all woven together in a cacophony of voices. Martin quickened his pace, but no matter how fast he walked, the end of the hallway seemed to stretch farther and farther away. Panic set in as the whispers became clearer, surrounding him, as if the very walls were speaking to him. "Why did you come here? She won't let you leave. You belong to her now." Suddenly, the lights flickered. The dim bulbs that hung from the ceiling sparked and sputtered before plunging the corridor into darkness. Martin's breathing became ragged as he reached for his phone to use its flashlight. His hands fumbled with the screen, and when the beam of light finally cut through the darkness, it fell on something that made his stomach lurch. At the far end of the hallway, just barely illuminated by his phone, the same woman from the mirror now stood. Her back was turned to him, her long, dirty veil trailing on the floor behind her. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, but her presence filled the hallway with a sense of dread so overwhelming. It felt like the air itself was suffocating him. Martin's legs felt like lead, his instincts screaming at him to run, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from her. His mind raced. If she was just an apparition, she couldn't hurt him, right? He'd heard of ghost sightings before, but those were just stories. People didn't get hurt. They didn't die from seeing something. But then she moved without warning. The ghostly bride began to turn her head slowly toward him. Her neck twisted at an unnatural angle, too far for any human. The sound of cracking bones filled the air as her face came into view, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that stared straight through him. Her lips were stained with blood, pulled into a crooked smile that chilled his soul. Martin stumbled backward, nearly tripping over himself as the bride began to walk toward him, her feet gliding eerily over the ground. She moved slowly, but with a purpose, her gaze never leaving his. The whispers rose again, now deafening, filling his head with accusations and venomous threats. He clamped his hands over his ears, trying to block out the sound, but it only grew louder, echoing inside his skull. With his heart hammering in his chest, Martin broke into a sprint. He ran blindly, no longer caring about the endless hallway or the mirrors that seemed to mock him with their cracked, distorted reflections. He just needed to get away, but the mansion had other plans. As he rounded a corner, the floor beneath him gave way with a loud crack, and he fell, crashing through rotten wood into the darkness below. Dust and debris filled the air as he landed hard on something cold and damp. His body ached, but it wasn't the pain that paralyzed him. It was the sound, the soft, slow scraping of a veil dragging across the floor above him. She was still there, and she was getting closer. Martin struggled to his feet, gasping for air. His flashlight flickered as he looked around. He had fallen into some kind of cellar. Damp stone walls surrounded him, and the air was thick with the smell of earth and decay. The only exit was a narrow staircase leading up into the blackness above. But before he could move, the whispers started again, this time coming from all around him. "Don't run. She'll find you. She always finds you." Terror clawed at Martin's insides. The whispers seemed to crawl under his skin, making it impossible to think. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to move, to run, to escape. But then, from the shadows at the far end of the cellar, something stirred. A figure began to rise from the ground, pale and misshapen. It wasn't the bride, but something else, something worse. Its limbs were twisted, its skin stretched tight over bones. Empty, hollow eyes stared out at him from a face that barely resembled anything human. It reached out a long, skeletal hand toward him. Martin's scream echoed through the mansion as he ran toward the stairs. But deep down, he knew. He was no longer alone, and he was far from safe. Martin's breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled up the narrow stairs, his feet slipping on the damp stone steps. The whispers followed him, rising and falling like the wind, but more sinister, more knowing. He could feel the presence of the twisted figure behind him, creeping ever closer. His only chance of escape lay in finding the way out of this cursed mansion. He reached the top of the stairs and found himself in a long, low-ceilinged corridor, lit only by the pale moonlight seeping through the cracked windows. The old wood creaked beneath his weight as he bolted down the hallway, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds, half expecting to see the skeletal figure or the ghostly bride right behind him. But the hallway was empty, except for the voices that clawed at his mind. "You can't run forever," one voice hissed. "She's waiting," another whispered almost playfully. "You're already hers." Martin forced himself to ignore them, his focus shifting to the door at the end of the hallway. It was large, ornate, and slightly ajar, the perfect escape. His legs burned as he pushed himself forward, adrenaline driving him faster. Just a few more feet. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Martin skidded to a halt, his heart dropping into his stomach. He grabbed the handle and yanked with all his strength, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked, no sealed, as though something on the other side had decided he wasn't leaving. Panic surged through him as he slammed his fists against the door. "Let me out," he shouted, his voice echoing through the house. "Please." But the only response was the sound of soft footsteps behind him. Martin whirled around, his back pressed against the door, clutching his useless camera like a lifeline. The hallway, though dimly lit, was empty. No figure. Nobody there. Nothing. Then, from the shadows, came the bride's voice again. Soft, slow, chilling. "Why are you running, Martin?" The sound of his name sent a jolt of terror through him. She knew him. The house knew him. He wasn't just some random intruder. It had lured him here, ensnaring him in its twisted web. The footsteps grew louder, closer, though there was still no sign of her. Martin's head swam with confusion and fear. He needed to think, to find another way out. There had to be another exit, maybe a window, or... His thoughts were interrupted by a loud thud directly above him, followed by a slow, dragging noise. He looked up, and his blood ran cold. The ceiling above him seemed to bow, as though something heavy was pressing down on it. Dust and small fragments of wood began to fall as the dragging sound moved along the ceiling, directly over his head. Whatever was above him, it was coming closer too. Without thinking, Martin turned and sprinted back down the hallway, his mind racing. He needed to find another way out, another door, anything. But every time he passed a door and tried the handle, it was locked tight. The mansion was sealing itself off, trapping him. The sound of dragging continued to follow him, no matter how fast he ran. It was relentless, as though the very walls were alive, twisting and reshaping themselves to ensure he had nowhere to go. The whispers, now louder than ever, began to laugh, cold, mocking laughter that chilled him to the bone. At last, he rounded a corner and stumbled into a small parlor. The room was filled with old, moth-eaten furniture and cobwebs thick enough to choke the air. But more importantly, in the far corner of the room, there was a window large enough for him to squeeze through. Martin rushed toward it, hope surging in his chest. He grabbed a nearby chair and threw it at the window with all his strength. The glass shattered into a million pieces, the cold night air rushing in like a breath of fresh life. Without wasting a second, he began to climb through, his hands shaking, his legs trembling with the effort. But just as he got halfway out, he felt something cold wrap around his ankle. It was like ice, thin, bony fingers that gripped him with an unnatural strength. Martin screamed and kicked, trying to shake free, but the hand only tightened, pulling him back into the room. He turned, his eyes wide with terror, and saw her. The bride. She was no longer the pale, sorrowful figure from the mirror. Her face had twisted into something monstrous, her eyes hollow and filled with malice. Her dress, once a tattered veil of sorrow, was now soaked in blood. She grinned at him, her lips splitting to reveal jagged, rotting teeth. "Leaving so soon?" she whispered, her voice a rasping mockery. Martin kicked again, harder this time, finally managing to free himself from her grip. He tumbled out of the window, falling onto the cold, wet ground below. Pain shot through his side as he hit the earth, but he didn't care. He was out. He was free. Or so he thought. As he staggered to his feet, the mansion loomed above him, its dark windows like empty eyes watching his every move. He stumbled away from the building, his heart still racing, but every step felt heavier, as though the ground itself was dragging him down. Then, from somewhere deep within the mansion, he heard the bride's voice once more, soft and sing-song. "You can run, Martin, but you'll never leave." The wind picked up, whipping through the trees, and for the first time, he realized the truth. The mansion wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and it wasn't going to let him go. Not yet. And as he stood there, gasping for breath, the twisted figure from the cellar appeared at the edge of the woods, staring at him with its hollow eyes. It was waiting for him to make his next move. But deep down, Martin knew he was trapped. Martin's legs burned as he sprinted across the mansion grounds, the sharp branches of overgrown bushes tearing at his clothes. His mind screamed at him to run faster, to put as much distance between himself and that cursed place as possible. But no matter how far he ran, the weight of the mansion clung to him, a presence that stretched beyond the rotting walls. The wind howled, carrying the bride's haunting whispers. Her voice seemed to slip through the air, twisting around him as if the mansion itself had no boundaries. "Do you really think you can leave me?" Martin's heart pounded in his chest, each word sending fresh waves of panic through him. The woods surrounding the mansion seemed to stretch on forever, an impenetrable maze of twisted trees and fog. The branches reached out like skeletal arms, the underbrush thick and unforgiving, slowing him down with every step. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet shifted. He stumbled, almost falling face first into the dirt. Looking down, he saw something that made his stomach churn with fear. The soil was fresh, recently disturbed, as if something had been buried here. Or someone. The whispers intensified, swirling around him like a taunting, invisible chorus. "They never get far. You'll be just like them." Martin's pulse quickened as he realized the truth. He wasn't the first person to try and escape. The ground beneath him was filled with the remains of others who had been trapped here before him, others who had dared to challenge the ghostly bride's domain. But there was no time to dwell on it. He had to keep moving. He ran deeper into the woods, the thick fog curling around him like a living thing. Every step felt heavier, like something was pulling him back, dragging him closer to the mansion no matter how far he went. The cold air stung his lungs, and every shadow seemed to shift and twist in his peripheral vision. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the bride gliding toward him, but she wasn't there. Instead, from the trees emerged a figure. No, several figures. They were pale and distorted, their faces twisted into expressions of agony. They moved slowly, their limbs jerking in unnatural angles as they staggered through the fog toward him. These weren't ghosts. They were something worse, the lost. The ones who had tried to escape before him, now bound to the mansion, doomed to wander the woods for eternity. Martin's breath hitched in his throat. He ran faster, pushing through the underbrush. But no matter how fast he moved, the figure seemed to close the distance with every step. The fog thickened around him, swallowing the light from the moon, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in front of him. Then, the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, echoed through the trees. He turned sharply, trying to stay quiet, his pulse racing. The footsteps didn't belong to the lost souls that shambled through the fog. They were deliberate. They belonged to her. He was sure of it. Martin stumbled through the trees, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The fog seemed to part just enough to reveal a crumbling stone wall in the distance. Could it be the edge of the mansion's grounds? His heart leapt with hope as he sprinted toward it, praying it was an escape. But as he drew closer, the sight that greeted him froze his blood. The wall wasn't the boundary of the mansion's land. It was a part of the mansion itself. He had run in a circle. Martin fell to his knees, gasping for breath. Despair gripped him as the full realization of his situation hit. There was no escape. The mansion had warped reality, twisting space itself to trap him. The bride's voice echoed through the fog, closer now, so close it seemed as though she was breathing down his neck. "You can't leave, Martin," she whispered, her voice a mix of sorrow and glee. "No one ever does." He stood, forcing his trembling legs to carry him toward the wall, toward the mansion. If running was futile, maybe he could hide. Maybe there was something inside, some secret to breaking the curse. But as he approached the wall, the ground shifted again beneath him, and he was plunged into darkness. He hit the ground hard, the air knocked from his lungs. Dazed, he looked up and realized he was back in the mansion, standing in a grand, decaying ballroom. The shattered glass from long-forgotten chandeliers littered the floor, and tattered drapes hung from the windows, blocking out any light from the outside world. A heavy, oppressive silence filled the room, but Martin could feel her presence. The bride was here, somewhere, watching, waiting. Desperation clawed at him as he looked for a way out. There had to be something, anything, a way to fight back, a way to end this nightmare. His eyes darted across the room and landed on an old, dust-covered piano at the far end of the ballroom. Beside it, a massive portrait hung on the wall. It was old and faded, but the image was unmistakable. The bride in her wedding gown, her eyes filled with sorrow. Martin approached the portrait, his hands trembling. There was something about it, something off. He reached out, brushing away the dust that covered the lower part of the frame, and froze. Written in red, smeared letters beneath the portrait were the words, "She won't rest until the vows are complete." Martin's heart raced as the whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. He turned to face the ballroom, but before he could react, the grand doors on the other side of the room slammed shut, locking him inside. And then, the bride appeared. She stood at the far end of the ballroom, her figure tall and menacing, her veil fluttering despite the absence of any wind. Her eyes, empty, hollow, yet burning with an otherworldly rage, locked onto Martin. "You'll be mine, Martin," she said softly, her voice echoing off the walls. "You promised." Martin backed away, his mind racing. He had never made any promise, never taken any vow, but it didn't matter. In her twisted mind, he had already become part of the mansion's endless cycle. The bride stepped forward, her movements slow but purposeful, the hem of her blood-stained gown dragging across the ballroom floor. Martin's heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled backward, his eyes darting around the room for an escape. There was nowhere left to run, and as she drew closer, the mansion seemed to close in around him, its walls breathing, alive, as if welcoming him into its eternal grasp. "Till death do us part," she whispered, extending her pale, bony hand toward him. Martin's body tensed as a cold, numbing dread washed over him. But he wasn't dead yet, not if he could help it. Martin's back slammed against the cold, unyielding wall of the ballroom as the bride glided closer, her hollow eyes fixed on him with a terrifying hunger. The mansion creaked and groaned around them, as though the house itself was preparing for the final moment, the culmination of her vengeance. He was trapped, but his survival instincts roared within him. There had to be a way out, something he could do to stop her. "Till death do us part," the bride repeated, her voice a cold, hollow echo of a promise never fulfilled. His mind raced. The words smeared on the portrait rang in his head. "She won't rest until the vows are complete." What did that mean? Complete the vows? Finish the ceremony? His stomach twisted with fear and disgust at the thought, but there was no other option. The mansion had twisted reality, trapping him in this nightmare, and the only way out seemed to be through her. His eyes darted back to the portrait of the bride, her face once beautiful, but now twisted in anger and grief. His fingers gripped the edges of the wall behind him as his brain churned, trying to figure out what the mansion wanted, what she wanted. Then, with a sickening realization, the answer became clear. She didn't just want revenge. She wanted what had been stolen from her all those years ago. She wanted the wedding that had never happened. Martin swallowed hard, his heart pounding as he stood up straighter, fighting every instinct that told him to run. If completing the vow was the only way to break the curse, then he had to go along with it, at least until he could find a way out. His legs trembled, but he took a step forward, facing the ghostly bride. Her empty eyes widened slightly, as if sensing his intention. She stopped in her tracks, watching him with an unsettling curiosity. "Let's finish this," Martin said, his voice barely above a whisper, but it carried through the ballroom like a final, doomed proclamation. I'll take the vow." For a moment, the bride didn't move. Her veil swayed slightly as she tilted her head, as if she didn't quite believe him. Then, slowly, she extended her skeletal hand toward him. Her bony fingers curled in a mockery of tenderness. Martin forced himself to step closer, his throat dry, his limbs stiff with fear. The air around him grew even colder, as though the life was being drained from him with every step he took. When his hand finally touched hers, a shock of ice surged through his body, freezing him to the core. Her skin was deathly cold, but he held on, forcing himself not to pull away. The mansion seemed to hold its breath. "You vow to me?" she asked, her voice trembling with an eerie mixture of hope and menace. Martin's lips quivered, his stomach churning with every word he forced out. "I vow to stay with you. Until death, do us part." The bride's hollow eyes flickered for a moment, as if somewhere deep within her, a spark of her former self had awakened. She stepped closer, her hand still clasping his. The darkness around them deepened, the walls of the ballroom warping and groaning, as though the house itself was shifting in response to his words. Then, her grip tightened painfully, and her face twisted once more into that grotesque grin, her jagged teeth flashing in the dim light. "Death is all that waits for you," she hissed. Suddenly, the ballroom shifted. The chandelier above them trembled, the floor beneath Martin's feet buckled, and the air became thick with the smell of decay. The walls began to close in, warping into the grotesque shape of writhing, skeletal figures, all staring at him with empty, soulless eyes. The mansion wasn't letting go, it was consuming him. Martin's heart raced as panic set in again. He had made the vow, but nothing had changed. He hadn't broken the curse. Instead, he had triggered something far worse. The bride's cold laughter filled the room, rising to a deafening pitch. She was going to take him, but as her laughter echoed around him, Martin noticed something. The portrait. The old, dusty portrait of the bride, hanging on the far wall, had started to change. The bride's once agonized expression in the painting was softening, as though some part of her was still trapped in that frame, longing for peace. He wrenched his hand free from her iron grip and stumbled toward the portrait. The bride's laughter stopped abruptly, her eyes narrowing as she realized what he was doing. "No!" she screeched, her voice raw with fury. Martin ran, ignoring the piercing cold that seemed to gnaw at his bones, and grabbed the frame with both hands. Without thinking, he ripped it from the wall and turned it over, searching for something, anything that could help him end this. Behind the portrait was a small, yellowed envelope hidden in the backing of the frame. Martin tore it open with shaking hands, and inside was a faded letter. The writing was barely legible, but the words were clear enough. "My love, I am sorry. I cannot go through with this. Forgive me, for I have no choice." It was a letter from her groom, the one who had abandoned her, the source of her rage. The bride's wail of fury filled the room as she surged toward him, her eyes wild with hatred. But Martin didn't stop. He held up the letter, her tragic past laid bare before her. "This is why you're here," Martin shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "He betrayed you, not me. You need to let go." The bride paused, her form flickering, her face twisting between fury and sorrow. Her hands trembled as she looked at the letter, as if some long-buried memory was rising to the surface. The mansion groaned again, but this time it sounded different, like a creature in its final moments, releasing its hold. Martin held his breath as the bride's form wavered. The ghostly light in her eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, he saw the woman she once was, beautiful, heartbroken, lost. Then, with a final, mournful sigh, the bride's form began to dissolve, her veil fluttering to the ground as she faded into the air, her presence vanishing like mist at dawn. The mansion, too, seemed to exhale, its oppressive weight lifting as the curse unraveled. The whispers stopped. The walls stopped groaning. The silence that filled the mansion was no longer suffocating. It was peaceful. Martin stood there, breathing heavily, his body trembling with the aftershock of the nightmare he had just survived. The mansion, once a prison of anger and despair, now felt empty, quiet. The haunting presence was gone. He stepped carefully through the ballroom, his legs weak beneath him, and made his way toward the grand doors. This time, they creaked open easily, as though the mansion was finally releasing him. Martin stepped outside, the cool night air hitting his face like a soothing balm. The fog had lifted, the oppressive gloom gone. In the distance, the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon. He walked toward his car, his body aching, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. But he was alive, and he was free. As he reached the car, he turned back to look at the mansion one last time. It stood silent and still, its dark windows staring out at the world like empty eyes. The bride was gone, but her story, her tragedy, would remain. And as Martin drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that though he had escaped, the mansion would always be waiting for the next soul to wander in.